Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. By now it should come as no surprise to you that Edgar Allan Poe wrote a lot of poetry about death. The death of his mother, the death of his foster mother, the death of his first love, death of his wife, just death in general. And just when you thought we've expended all the possible variations on that subject, we've got a new one for you. Poetry written about Poe's death by other poets. And that will be the subject of tonight's most melancholy installment of the Curator's Crypt. Edgar Allan Poe's sudden death at the age of 40 back in 1849 came as a shock to people. He was at the height of his powers, writing some of his best work. He'd been traveling the country on a lecture tour. He'd just become engaged. And he was about to start his own magazine. So everything was looking up. And then all of a sudden he dies. So there was an outpouring of grief from his fans across the nation. And they started publishing poems in magazines and newspapers all over the country. And this is one of the first ones. This is a clipping of Sarah T. Bolton's poem on the death of Edgar A. Poe, written November 1st, 1849, so less than a month after his death. And this one appeared as here in newspapers all over the place. And Sarah T. Bolton, she's considered the unofficial poet laureate of Indiana. Her best-known poems are Paddle Your Canoe and Indiana. She was also a champion of women's rights and collaborated during Indiana's 1850 Constitutional Convention to include the recognition of women's property rights in the revised state constitution of 1851. Let's see what she had to say about Poe. And I'm not going to read you the whole poem because we'd be here all night. They have laid thee down to slumber, where the sorrows that encumber such a wild and wayward heart as thine can ne'er reach again. For the radiant light of gladness never alternates again with sadness, stinging gifted souls to madness on that bright and blessed shore, safely moored from sorrow's tempest on the distant Aden shore. Rest thee, lost one, evermore. Well, that was a poem written by someone who knew of Poe by reputation. Here's one from somebody a little bit closer to home. This is by the poet Francis Sargent Osgood. Now, Poe and Osgood used to exchange flirtatious poetry to each other about 4 years before Poe's death. In fact, their relationship got so scandalous that they were soon forbidden to see each other after a busybody named Elizabeth Elliot supposedly found a love letter from Osgood to Poe lying open on a table in his house. But after he died, she wrote a poem about it. And this is Osgood's poetical works. This came out just after her death. She died not even a year after Poe's death. She died in May of 1850. And some of her friends got together and published a book of her greatest poems. And one of the ones way in the back here is about Poe. Now, so far we've seen the obvious thing that people make references in their poems to the Raven. It's his biggest hit. But a lot of people also made references to his poem Israfel. That's an early work by Poe in which he says that Israfel, the angel who has the most beautiful voice in all of heaven, wouldn't sing nearly as well if he'd had to suffer like Poe had suffered. And if Poe hadn't had to suffer, if he'd had the life in heaven that Israfel had known, he'd sing better than anyone could possibly imagine. So this is Osgood's poem about Poe, The Hand That Swept the Sounding Lyre. And once again, I'm just going to read part of it. The hand that swept the sounding lyre with more than mortal skill, the lightning eye, the heart of fire, the fervent lip are still. No more in rapture or in woe with melody to thrill. Ah, nevermore. Oh, bring the flowers he cherished so with eager childlike care, for o'er his grave they'd love to grow and sigh their sorrow there. Ah me, no more their balmy glow may soothe this heart's despair. No, nevermore. But angel hands shall bring him balm for every grief he knew, and heaven's soft harps his soul shall calm with music sweet and true, and teach to him the holy charm of Israfel anew, forevermore. Now, people, not just Poe, really loved Frances Osgood. So in addition to publishing this collection of her works, some of her friends got together and published this memorial volume to her, full of reminiscences of her, poems about her. And one of the contributors was her friend Anne Poe's former fiancée, Sarah Helen Whitman. She'd been engaged to him about a year before his death. So when she had the chance to write a poem about Frances Osgood, she contributed this one, To Him Whose Heartstrings Were a Lute. It starts out a little like this. I mourn thee not, no words can tell the solemn calm that tranced my breast, when first I knew thy soul had passed from earth to its eternal rest. For doubt and darkness o'er thy head forever waved their condor wings, and in their murky shadows bred forms of unutterable things. And all around thy silent hearth, the glory that once blushed and bloomed was but a dim remembered dream of the old time entombed. Few were the hearts whose music woke to thy weird harp that loved to dwell on far-off fairy lands forlorn, the wild, sweet harp of Israfel. So at the same time that people were dedicating poems to Poe, praising his memory, he was moldering in an unmarked grave in Baltimore. It would be 26 years before he finally got a monument for his grave, and it was a big occasion. In fact, this book was published to mark the occasion. It's Edgar Allan Poe Memorial Volume. So this is the monument they erected to Poe in 1875. And Sarah Sigourney Rice was a teacher, and she was sort of the leader of the movement to build this monument for Poe and finally get him recognized. And when they were giving all the addresses in Poe's honor, she read this new poem over Poe's grave. And it's called At Poe's Grave. It's by William Winter. They called him Weeping Willie because he specialized in writing this sort of thing. He wrote poems to be read at celebrity funerals. So that's sort of his thing. So this is a little bit of his poem that Sarah Sigourney Rice read at Poe's grave. Cold as the paean honor sings, and chill as glory's icy breath, and pale the garland memory brings to grace the iron doors of death. Fame's echoing thunders long and loud, the pomp and pride that decks the pall, the plaudits of the vacant crowd. One word of love is worth them all. With dews of grief our eyes are dim. I'll let the tear of sorrow start, and honor ourselves in him, the great and tender human heart. And it gets kind of better at the end. And may his spirit, hovering nigh, pierce the dense cloud of darkness through, and know with fame that cannot die, he has the world's affection too. And this wasn't the last time that Winter would be tasked with writing a poem in memory of Poe. 10 years later, he got commissioned to write one for this monument. It was the Actors Memorial to Poe that was built for New York City, not for Poe's grave in Baltimore. And these are the lines he wrote right down here. It says, he was great in his genius, unhappy in his life, wretched in his death, but in his fame, he is immortal. Well, I don't know how I felt about having someone carve that you were wretched in your death into your memorial, but at least it ended on a high note. Now, another one of the poems published in this book was by a French poet, a very important French symbolist poet named Stéphane Mallarmé. It was called The Tomb of Edgar Poe. It goes a little like this. Such as into himself as last eternity changes him, the poet with a naked sword provokes his century appalled to not have known death triumph in that strange voice. They, like an upstart hydra wearing the angel once purify the meaning of tribal words, proclaimed out loud the prophecy drunk without honor and the tide of some black mixture. So it sort of sets the tone of how Poe really came to life after his death, and he's proven everybody else wrong. And I think Richard Wilbur's translation of that first line says a little bit better. He starts out, changed by eternity to himself at last. So it's almost like eternity or death made Poe complete, and the passage of time has only proven him right. And we can sort of look back and say, hey, maybe that is kind of right. Maybe Poe has been vindicated over the passage of time. So these are some pretty nice tributes to Poe. But what about some poems from people who just plain hated him? Well, there's guy Richard Henry Stoddard, who despised Poe. He wrote of Poe, as a poet, Poe ranks high, although most of his poetry is unreadable. The school of literature to which Poe belongs, and of which he is certainly the master, is the one that we thoroughly dislike. So that really sets the tone for his poem, which appears in the March 1853 issue of the National Magazine. So this is about 4 years after Poe's death. And it's an article called Edgar Allan Poe. See, there's a little picture of Poe there. And it's bad enough that Stoddard wrote the article really trashing Poe. He says, I'm going to do one better. And I'll print this poem I wrote about him when I heard he died. It's called Miseramus, which is Latin again, but you can sort of guess what it means. I mean, this means the most miserable, the most unhappy, the most melancholy. And here's what Stoddard had to say. He has passed away for a world of strife, fighting the wars of time and life. The leaves will fall when the winds are loud, and the snows of winter will weave his shroud. But he will never, never know anything more of leaves or snow. The summer tide of his life was past, and his hopes were fading, fading fast. His faults were many, his virtues few, a tempest with flecks of heaven's blue. He might have soured to the gates of light, but he built his nest with the birds of night. He glimmered apart in solemn gloom, like a dying lamp in a haunted tomb. He touched his lute with a magic spell, but all his melodies breathed of hell, raising the Frits and the ghouls and the pallid ghost of the damned souls. But he lies in dust, and the stone is rolled o'er his sepulchre dark and cold. Let us forget the path he trod, and leave him now with his master God. This guy really hates Poe. But there's some nice passages in it. I like how he says that his melodies are breathed of hell, raising the drifts and the ghouls. I mean, that's kind of nice. And Stoddard might unintentionally have portrayed Poe here as somebody who is the outcast, that he's the rebel fighting against people just like Richard Henry Stoddard who don't quite get it. that Poe is ahead of his time and that he's not afraid to stare the ghouls and death in the face and to write with the very fires of hell at his back. And Poe actually wrote a short essay about how if you really wanted to write a great book, the page would practically burn as soon as your pen wrote it. I mean, this was going to be such an extraordinary book. It would be called My Heart Laid Bare. And that's kind of what Poe did. So he was really opening up to the darkness, not afraid, not shying away from it. So I think Stoddard didn't quite get that. So what do you think? Which of these was your favorite tribute to Poe? Let us know down in the comments. And also, if you got any suggestions for future videos, write those down there too. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces like these tributes to Poe, why not support the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. And now that I've darkened your day, why don't I lift the melancholy spirit just a little bit with some gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing adorable Poe Museum cat stuff.